A 15-year-old homeless girl rescued a wealthy woman. 1 hour later, her secret was out. Chapter 1. The fire and the girl. Nobody saw the Halcyon Hills neighborhood did not burn often. It was the kind of place that had its own private security patrol, its own HOA-mandated fire-resistant landscaping ordinances, its own sense of insulation from the kind of catastrophe that happened to other neighborhoods in other parts of the city. The houses sat on 2-acre lots behind gated driveways, and the residents slept soundly because they had paid, in very specific dollar amounts, for the right to sleep soundly. Which was why, when the fire started at 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday in September, no one was immediately ready. Ivy Chen had been living behind the neighborhood for 7 weeks, not behind it in any official sense. There was a greenbelt, a strip of protected woodland that ran along the neighborhood's eastern edge, separating the back fences of the estate properties from a small creek and then more trees. The city maintained it intermittently. No one walked it regularly, which was exactly why Ivy had chosen it. She was 15 years old. She had her mother's old canvas backpack, a sleeping bag rated to 40 degrees, a solar charger for her phone, a water purification straw, a first aid kit she'd assembled herself from 3 different dollar stores over the course of a careful week, and a library card she still carried because it felt important to carry it even though the account was technically under her mother's name. Her mother had been dead for 4 months. Her father for 2 years before that. She had one aunt in another state who had been called by the hospital and had not returned the call. She was not helpless. She had read the right books, and she had her father's methodical mind, and she had found in the greenbelt a dry spot between 2 large oaks where she could make herself effectively invisible. She went to the public library during the day to do the schoolwork she was still doing, privately, stubbornly, because stopping felt like admitting something she wasn't prepared to admit. She woke at 2:17 not because of the smoke the wind was carrying it east, but because of the sound, a particular quality of crackling that her brain correctly identified as significant before she was fully conscious. She unzipped her sleeping bag and looked through the tree line. The house 3 lots down was on fire. Not fully, not yet. The garage was fully engulfed and the flames were reaching the wooden trellis on the side of the house, climbing toward the 2nd floor with the specific, patient efficiency of fire that has found good fuel. And there was someone in the upstairs window. Ivy could see her figure behind glass, pressing both hands flat against the pane. The light from the fire below made it easy to see her silhouette. She was not breaking the window. She was not opening it. She was pressing against it with the helpless, particular body language of someone who could not make their body do what their mind was screaming at them to do. Ivy was over the back fence in 40 seconds. She had her phone out as she ran, already dialing 911, already assessing the back of the house, the patio door, the outdoor furniture, the climbing structure for what must be a child, the 2nd floor window with the figure, the way the fire had taken the garage completely but had not yet breached the main structure. 911. What's your emergency? House fire at. She reached the back fence, hoisted over it, landed on the patio, read the house number from the side of the back door. 24 Halcyon Ridge Lane. Active fire, garage and spreading. Possible person trapped on the 2nd floor, northwest bedroom. Send fire and ambulance. Are you inside the residence? About to be. She tried the back patio door. Locked. She picked up a ceramic planter, heavy, and she felt it in her shoulders and broke the glass panel beside the handle cleanly, reached in, unlocked it, and pushed through. The ground floor was clear of fire but full of smoke. She stayed low. She moved through what appeared to be a kitchen, a living room, to the stairs. She felt the banister for heat before putting her weight on the stairs cool enough. She went up fast. The northwest bedroom was the 2nd door on the right. She knocked hard. I'm here to help. Move away from the window. A sound from inside. High, frightened female. Move away from the window and unlock the door. I'm not going to hurt you. The lock clicked. The woman who opened the door was in her mid-50s, wearing a silk robe, her silver-streaked hair loose around her face, her expression cycling rapidly between terror and the specific disorientation of someone pulled from sleep into crisis. She was gripping the doorframe with both hands and she was shaking. Behind her, on the bed, was a small dog that was demonstrating more composure than anyone in the room. "Stairs," Ivy said. "We need to go now. Put your hand on my shoulder and don't let go. My husband, he's in the city. He's not, then it's just us. Hand on my shoulder. Let's go." She got them down the stairs and out the patio door and across the yard to the fence before the fire reached the main structure. She helped the woman over the fence with both hands. The woman was not young and was still shaking, and she passed the dog over too, and then she climbed over herself and they stood in the greenbelt as the sirens began approaching and the fire lit the sky orange. The woman was staring at her. Ivy became aware in this moment of how she must look. Unwashed hair, clothes that had been worn several days, the sleeping bag that had been caught in her sprint and was still dragging from her hand, the backpack she'd grabbed automatically and hadn't set down. The woman looked from Ivy's face to the backpack to the sleeping bag to the oak trees and the small flattened area of undergrowth that was, clearly, someone's camp. "You live out here," she said. Not an accusation, not pity. A statement delivered with the careful precision of someone who was nomming a thing correctly. "The fire trucks are almost here," Ivy said. "You should go to the front. What's your name?" The sirens were very close now. Red light strobed through the trees. "Ivy," she said. "Margaret Calloway." The woman straightened despite her shaking hands, an instinctive, decades-old reflex of composure. "And you just saved my life." She looked at the sleeping bag in Ivy's hand. "Don't run. Please don't run. I want to help you." Ivy looked at her. In the orange firelit dark, covered in smoke, with her dog tucked under one arm and her robe singed at the hem, Margaret Calloway did not look like someone performing charity. She looked like someone who had just had an enormous thing happen and was trying very hard to be equal to it. Ivy didn't run. Chapter 2. The morning after the death, the hospital kept Margaret for 4 hours of smoke inhalation observation. She refused to leave the waiting area until Ivy had been seen by a doctor first, which Ivy objected to and Margaret ignored with the serene, implacable quality of someone who has been making decisions in boardrooms for 30 years and is not remotely intimidated by a 15-year-old's objections, however well articulated. The doctor who examined Ivy was young, thorough, and professionally neutral about the smoke in her hair and the state of her jacket. He noted a healing bruise on her left forearm, slightly elevated cortisol markers consistent with chronic stress, and a body weight slightly below the expected range for her height and age. He wrote it all down. He did not editorialize. He did quietly flag the chart for the social worker on call. Ivy saw him flag it. She had known it was coming. Margaret's husband, Edward Calloway, arrived at the hospital at 4:30 in the morning, having driven 90 minutes from a conference in the city. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that was naturally commanding and had chosen, over the years, to be kind with it. He came through the ER entrance and went directly to his wife and held her for a long time without speaking. Then he stepped back, held her face in his hands, looked at her carefully, satisfied himself that she was intact, said, "The garage is gone. The fire department contained it before it reached the main structure." Margaret's voice was steady. "Edward, I need you to meet someone." She brought him to the corner of the waiting room where Ivy was sitting with her backpack on her lap, having declined the hospital's offer of a gown and the social worker's offer of a conversation. "This is Ivy," Margaret said. "She came over the back fence, broke through the patio door, came upstairs and got me out. She also called 911 on the way in." A pause. "She's 15. She's been living in the greenbelt." Edward Calloway looked at Ivy with an expression that was not pity. Pity has a downward vector, and this was level. He extended his hand. "Edward Calloway, my wife is alive because of you." Shook his hand. "She had her father's handshake. The fire investigator will need to speak with you," he continued. "You were the first on scene, but that can wait until you've rested." He looked at her backpack. "Where are you planning to go when you leave here?" "I'll be fine." "I didn't ask if you'd be fine. I asked where you're going." Ivy looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them blinked for a moment. "I don't have a specific location," she said, with the precision of someone choosing words carefully. "Then you'll come to the hotel where I was staying last night. We have a suite. There's a second room." He said it the way he probably said most things, as a proposed solution to a logistical problem, clearly and without excessive ornamentation. We're not going to pretend you don't need somewhere to sleep, and you're not going to pretend you have somewhere to be. Deal? Ivy thought about the greenbelt, about the sleeping bag with smoke on it, about the flattened space between the oaks that had been, by necessity, home. Deal, she said. The hotel room had a real bed and a real shower and a minibar that Ivy did not touch and a window that looked out over the city in the early morning light. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, fully dressed, adjusting to the specific disorientation of being indoors with the expectation of staying. She showered. She put her own clothes back on because they were all she had. She sat at the desk and opened her phone and worked on the essay she owed herself. She'd been tracking her own assignments on a spreadsheet, maintaining a private educational record that had no official standing, but that she'd kept anyway because the discipline of it mattered. At 7, Margaret knocked and asked if she'd like breakfast. Over eggs and coffee in the hotel restaurant, Ivy ate methodically, the way hungry people do when they're trying not to appear desperate. Margaret asked her questions without the interrogative urgency of the social worker. She asked about her parents, about school, about the greenbelt and how long and how. Ivy answered in the same way she'd answered the doctor, accurately, without embellishment, without the softening gloss that people sometimes put on hard stories to make them more comfortable for the listener. Margaret listened to all of it with the full attention of someone who has learned that listening is the most powerful thing you can do in a room. Your mother died in May, she said when Ivy finished. Yes. And you went to the greenbelt in June. Yes. Why not to a shelter? Ivy looked at her coffee. I looked up the youth shelters in this city. The reviews, not official reviews. Reviews from people who'd actually used them. The accounts were consistent. She paused. I calculated that I had a better chance of maintaining my safety, my health, and my educational progress in a controlled outdoor environment that I chose and managed myself, than in a system that would place me in facilities with conditions I had no control over. She looked up. I know it sounds like an extremely intelligent and extremely frightened teenager who made the best decision she could with the information and resources she had, Margaret said. Ivy had nothing to say to that. It was one of the more accurate sentences anyone had said to her in 4 months. Chapter 3. The System versus the Calloways. Fighting for a home. The social worker's name was Mr. Gerald Finch. He arrived at the hotel at 10 a.m. with the procedural inevitability of weather. He was not unkind. He was also not, in any meaningful way, listening to what Ivy was saying versus what his intake form needed from her. He had an available placement at Riverside Youth Shelter. He had a process. The process had been designed for good reasons and was now being applied in a way that had drifted considerably from those reasons, as processes tend to do. Ivy, I understand this is a difficult situation, but placement at a licensed facility is what's the staff-to-resident ratio at Riverside? Ivy asked. Finch paused. I don't have that figure 1:14 on overnight shifts according to the 2023 inspection report, which is publicly available. The state standard is 1:8. She looked at him steadily. I researched this. I'm not being difficult. I'm being informed. Finch looked at his tablet, then at Ivy, then at Margaret Calloway, who was sitting beside Ivy with the air of someone who has hired a great many lawyers and knows when one is needed. Mr. Finch, Margaret said, my husband and I have contacted our attorney this morning about emergency foster placement. We understand there's a process. We're prepared to move through that process as quickly as the system will allow, and we're prepared to ensure Ivy has a safe, stable situation in the meantime. She paused. What do you need from us to make that happen? Finch looked between them. He was a man doing a job with too many cases and too few resources, and Ivy understood this about him. She did not blame him for the system any more than she blamed the greenbelt for being cold in October. Emergency placement review takes 48 hours minimum, he said. During that period, Ivy will be staying in our hotel suite under our supervision, Edward said from across the table. He had joined them at 9 and had spent the intervening hour on his phone with their attorney, a woman named Claire Hassan who had apparently already filed 3 documents before 10 a.m. Ms. Hassan has the paperwork for our emergency foster application. Home safety assessment is already scheduled for tomorrow morning. We have no priors, a stable household, and a very compelling reason to move quickly. Finch looked at his tablet again. At the paperwork Edward slid across the table, he was a man with too many cases. The Calloways were clearly not a risk. Ivy was clearly not a risk. The paperwork was clearly already done. I'll need to check in with Ivy independently, he said. That's non-negotiable, of course, Margaret said. Finch spoke with Ivy alone for 20 minutes in the hotel lobby. He asked her if she felt safe. He asked her if anyone had pressured her. He asked what she wanted. I want to go to school, Ivy said. A real school. I've been tracking my own curriculum for 4 months, but I'm missing lab time for my chemistry and physics credits, and I'm worried about the gap affecting my academic record. She paused. I want to have a real address so I can register. That's what I want. Finch looked at her for a moment. He wrote something on his tablet. I'll expedite the review, he said. The Calloway house was repaired and livable within 3 weeks. The fire damage had been largely structural to the garage and cosmetic to the main house's exterior. In the meantime, the hotel suite was home, and it turned out that Margaret Calloway, in her professional life, was the founding partner of Calloway Strategic Consulting, a firm that worked with nonprofits and education foundations, and that the work she brought to the hotel's dining table each morning was frequently fascinating. Ivy started asking questions on the 3rd morning. By the end of the week, she was reading Margaret's briefing documents and offering observations that Margaret found herself writing down. You could have been a management consultant, Margaret said on the 8th day. I'm going to be an aerospace engineer, Ivy said. But I'm interested in systems, any kind of systems. They all have the same underlying logic problems. Margaret looked at her over her laptop screen. Edward, she called toward the other room. I heard, Edward called back. Chapter 4. The secret the police found the revelation 1 hour later. This is where the story turned. The fire investigators' report came back 6 days after the fire. Captain Reyes of the Halcyon Hills Fire Department delivered it to the Calloways personally, which Margaret later said she should have recognized as unusual. Investigators didn't typically hand-deliver reports. He asked if Ivy could be present for the conversation. They sat in the hotel suite. Captain Reyes had a folder. He opened it. The fire was arson, he said. Accelerant was found at 3 points in the garage structure, placed deliberately and ignited remotely. We have the device. He paused. We also have security footage from your neighbor's camera system, Mrs. Calloway, which captured the back of your property from 11 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. He looked at Ivy. We see you coming over the fence at 2:19. We see you breaking the patio door at 2:21. We see you and Mrs. Calloway coming over the fence at 2:26. He put down the folder. I want to be clear that the timeline is unambiguous. You entered the property after the fire started. You had no involvement in the arson. Obviously, Margaret said, yes. Captain Reyes looked slightly uncomfortable. But the footage also showed us something else. When we enhanced the footage around the 11 p.m. timestamp 2 hours before the fire, we can see someone moving along the greenbelt tree line. Not on your property, in the trees. He looked at Ivy again. We believe this was you. Ivy said nothing. She was very still. You were awake at 11 p.m., said. Which means you may have seen or heard something before the fire started. I was reading, Ivy said. I had a headlamp. Did you see anyone? A pause that was slightly too long. Yes, Ivy said. The room went very quiet. There was a car, she said, parked on the service road behind the greenbelt. It had been there before twice earlier in the week. I noted it because I pay attention to vehicles near where I'm sleeping. It's a habit. She looked at the folder on the table. Gray sedan. Partial plate. The first 3 characters were H4K. The driver got out at approximately 11:10. He went along the fence line toward the Calloway property. He was there for approximately 20 minutes. When he left, I smelled something. I wasn't sure what it was at the time. Reyes had his notebook out. Why didn't you report this? I wasn't sure what I'd smelled. I noted it and went back to sleep. A pause. If I'd known it was accelerant, I would have reported it. I went over the fence the moment I saw the fire because I saw someone in the window, and that was a clear emergency. I didn't make the connection until right now. Reyes looked at his notebook, at the partial plate. He reached for his radio. He stepped outside. He was back in 4 minutes. H4K, we have a gray sedan registered to a Victor Strand. He has a prior for a property crime in this county. He looked at Margaret. Mrs. Calloway, does that name mean anything to you? Margaret had gone very still. Victor Strand, she said slowly. He was a contractor. He did landscaping work for us 2 years ago. We terminated his contract after equipment went missing from the property. She paused. We filed a police report. The case was closed without charges. He sent us a letter afterward that was, she looked at Edward, threatening enough that we kept it. Where is the letter? In our home safe, which is intact. Reyes nodded. I'm going to need that letter, and I'm going to need a formal statement from both of you. He looked at Ivy. And I'm going to need a statement from you too. He paused. Going to run your information through our system, Ivy. Standard procedure for witnesses. Is there anything you want to tell me before I do that? Ivy looked at him steadily. My full name is Ivy Chen Parsons. My parents were Raymond Parsons and Lee Chen Parsons. My father died 2 years ago. My mother died in May of this year. I've been a ward of no one because no guardian contacted by the hospital responded. She paused. That's what you're going to find. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. There's one more thing, he said carefully. When we ran the enhanced footage and filed the incident report this morning, the system flagged your mother's name. He set a printed document on the table. Lee Chen Parsons filed a missing persons report for her daughter you in March. That report has been in the system as an open case since then. He looked at Ivy directly. You've been officially missing for 6 months. The room was absolutely silent. Ivy stared at the document. Her mother had filed the report in March 2 months before she died. She had apparently not closed the case, and the case, in the bureaucratic inertia of an understaffed system, had remained open, which meant that for 6 months, Ivy Chen Parsons had been officially a missing child. That's why I couldn't find her records, Finch said later when he was called in. She was in the missing persons database, not the foster care intake system. The two databases don't automatically cross-reference. He pinched the bridge of his nose. She was invisible to us because she was listed as missing. Margaret looked at Ivy with an expression that Ivy found difficult to categorize. It was composed of several things at once, including fury at a system and grief for what Ivy had carried and something more immediate and certain. It changes nothing about what we're doing, Margaret said. She said it to Finch, but she was looking at Ivy, except that now there's even more paperwork, which is fine. We'll do the paperwork. Chapter 5. The man who came back the escalation in crisis Victor Strand was arrested on Thursday. He was released on bail on Saturday. Sergeant Delgado, who had taken over the arson case from the fire investigators once the criminal charge was established, called Edward on Saturday afternoon with the news and the particular tone of a law enforcement professional who disagreed with a judicial decision and was required to inform you of it professionally. His attorney argued he was not a flight risk. The judge agreed. A pause. He has conditions of release. He's not permitted within 500 feet of your home or your persons. He was permitted within 5 feet of our home while burning it down, Edward said. I understand, Mr. Calloway. What are we supposed to do with this information? Sergeant Delgado gave them what practical advice she could, which was honest and limited. Varying their routes, avoiding predictable schedules, notifying Ivy's school of the situation so security could be briefed. The school part complicated things. Ivy had been enrolled at Westfield Academy, the Calloways' local school, for 8 days. She had been, in those 8 days, the subject of her chemistry teacher's undisguised enthusiasm, the cross-country coach's politely aggressive recruitment, and the library staff's confusion about how a new student had already read 40% of the available physics curriculum texts. The school's security coordinator was a former law enforcement officer named Dennis who took the briefing seriously and updated the visitor protocols immediately. He showed Ivy, personally, the locations of all secondary exits and the direct line to his office. If you see him, Dennis said, you do not approach. You go to the nearest staff member and you say code blue. Everyone here will know what that means. Okay, Ivy said. It happened on a Tuesday. Ivy was in the science wing, third period, helping Mrs. Obi set up a titration experiment because she'd finished the prep work 12 minutes early. She was at the fume hood when she saw him through the window, the parking lot, the gray sedan, a man who was sitting inside it with the specific, terrible stillness of someone watching a building. She turned around. "Obi," she said, with a calm that she'd been building for 15 minutes alone in a greenbelt and 7 months alone in the world. Code Blue. Victor Strand did not enter the building. He was still in the parking lot in the sedan when 2 police units arrived 4 minutes after Dennis's call. He argued from the parking lot that he had not violated the restraining order because he had not approached within 500 feet of the Calloways' persons. They weren't in the building. This argument did not work as well as his attorney had apparently suggested it might. He was arrested for violating the terms of his release. The Calloway residence was listed on the protective order, and the school, as Ivy's current primary residence addresses associated institution, had been added to the order at Sergeant Delgado's preemptive request 24 hours earlier, a piece of foresight that everyone was now very grateful for. He did not make bail the second time. Ivy learned this in Dennis's office, where she had been sitting with tea that someone had brought her, and her chemistry textbook open on her knee because sitting was fine and stress was not an excuse to fall behind. And when Sergeant Delgado called with the news, she set the phone down and looked at her textbook for a moment. "He's in custody," she told Dennis. "Good," Dennis said. "Yes," Ivy said. She picked up her pencil and went back to the problem set. Chapter 6. The night that mattered, the crisis, the secondary crisis, arrived from a direction no one had been watching. Margaret had been managing, that was the word she used, and Ivy had understood it to be a very specific and active verb in Margaret's vocabulary. Managing the insurance claim, managing the temporary living situation, managing her consulting work, managing her husband's concern, managing her own response to having been woken by fire in her own bedroom. Managing. She was very good at it right up until the night of the Thursday after Strand's second arrest, when Ivy heard a different kind of sound from the hotel suite's main bedroom, not the careful, controlled sound of management, something that had slipped past management's defenses. Ivy knocked. "Come in." Margaret was sitting on the edge of the bed. She had her phone in her hand and she was looking at a photograph on it, the Calloway house pre-fire. With the garden in summer bloom and the garage that no longer existed, she looked up at Ivy. Her composure was entirely intact. Her eyes were entirely not. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to wake you, you didn't." Ivy sat down on the armchair by the window. She didn't offer anything, she just sat because she had learned that sometimes people need a presence more than they need words. They were quiet for a while. "I built that garden," Margaret said eventually. 31 years. "I started it the year we bought the house." She looked at the phone. "The garage stored everything, 30 years of files, my mother's furniture, things that can't be replaced." A pause. "I know that it sounds true," Ivy said. Margaret looked at her. Something in her face shifted, not breaking but softening. "You've lost much more than a garden." "Yes," Ivy said, "but that doesn't make your loss smaller. Grief isn't comparative." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Your mother said something like that." Ivy looked at the window. The city lights made the dark outside seem less absolute. "She was a therapist. She said grief doesn't fit in a hierarchy. She said the worst loss you've ever experienced is always the worst loss because you only have your own experience to measure against." She paused. "I think about that a lot now." Margaret set down the phone. "Tell me about her," she said. "Tell me about your mother." Ivy had not talked about her mother. Not to the doctor, not to Finch, not to Captain Ray's, not even fully to Margaret yet. She had given the facts: birth, death, profession, but not the person. She looked at the city lights and she talked. She talked about her mother's terrible puns and excellent dumplings, about the way she'd annotated every book she owned, and how Ivy had spent the first week after her death reading the annotations like a second text, her mother's thoughts in the margins of other people's thoughts, about how she'd been a first-generation immigrant who'd built an entirely American career out of sheer intellectual tenacity, and had passed that tenacity on like a birthright. She talked until she noticed Margaret had fallen asleep sitting up against the headboard, not from disinterest, but from the relief of someone who has been holding tension for weeks and has finally, in the presence of something real, let it go. Ivy got the extra blanket from the closet. She laid it over Margaret. She turned off the lamp. She went back to her room and sat at the desk and opened her notebook and wrote her mother's name at the top of a clean page. She wrote it in her mother's handwriting, which she'd spent 2 years practicing because she loved the way her mother's letters curved. She left it there. Chapter 7. What the city learned the secret. Fully out. The missing persons case closure generated a report. Missing persons case closures did not typically generate media attention. This one did because of the confluence of factors that made it statistically anomalous. A child listed as missing for 6 months who had during that period saved the life of a prominent community figure during an arson incident, observed evidence that led to the arrest of the arsonist, and been enrolled in school under emergency foster placement with a case already pending. The reporter who filed the story, a journalist named Priya at the local newspaper who covered social services and municipal systems, did it carefully and with Ivy's reluctant permission, because Ivy had agreed that if the story was going to exist, it should be accurate. The headline read, "Missing for 6 months, 15-year-old girl was hiding in plain sight and saving lives." The story focused not on Ivy specifically, but on the System Gap 2 databases that didn't cross-reference, a missing persons report that hadn't connected to a foster care intake, a child who had been invisible to the people meant to find her because of an administrative failure. It was a story about a system. Ivy happened to be the human evidence at the center of it. The response was larger than anyone expected. Letters came to the newspaper, then to the Calloways' address, which had been listed in property records and which people had apparently found. Most were kind. Several were from people who had experienced similar system failures with their own children or relatives. 3 were from educators who wanted to discuss Ivy's academic situation. 1 was from the director of the Regional STEM Academy, Dr. Fontaine, who wrote a letter addressed directly to Ivy suggesting she look at their scholarship program. Ivy read every letter. She responded to 3 personally. Dr. Fontaine, a woman named Harriet who had written about losing her own daughter to a system gap 15 years ago, and a man named Thomas who said he'd been a homeless teenager in this city 30 years ago and was now an engineer, and wanted her to know that the trajectory she was on was a real trajectory. "I'm already planning to be an aerospace engineer," she wrote back to Thomas. "But thank you for making it feel more like a fact than a plan." The emergency foster placement became permanent foster placement in November. The paperwork was, as Margaret had promised, significant. Claire Hassan handled it with the efficient satisfaction of an attorney doing work she believed in. Mr. Finch, to his credit, expedited everything he could and then expedited things he hadn't known he could. The night before the approval came through, Ivy sat with Margaret and Edward in the hotel suite. They were still in the hotel. The house repairs were taking longer than expected, and Margaret said, carefully, that they wanted to discuss something. "We know that foster placement is what's formally been arranged," she said. "And we know that you've been very clear about what you need and what you're comfortable with, and we've tried very hard to follow your lead." She paused. "But we want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'd like to discuss adoption." Ivy looked at them. Edward said, "There's no timeline, there's no pressure. We know you have parents who were real and who loved you and who aren't replaceable. We're not proposing to replace them." He said it with the plain directness of someone who has thought about exactly the right way to say something and is saying it. "We're proposing to add to what they gave you, if you'd ever want that." Ivy was quiet for a long time. "I'll think about it," she said. It was the most open sentence she'd said to anyone since February. Chapter 8. Ivy Calloway. 6 months later, the Westfield Academy cross-country invitational happened on a Saturday in April when the air was cold and bright, and the course ran through the school grounds and along the edge of the park and back. 4 miles of asphalt and trail that Ivy had been running 3 mornings a week since October. She ran it in 21 minutes and 53 seconds. Coach Brennan looked at his stopwatch and said absolutely nothing for 4 seconds, which was longer than he'd ever been silent on a race day. Then he said, "That's the third fastest time in this school's history." With the flat precision of someone stating a fact, he is actively trying not to make into a bigger deal than it is. In the stands in the front row, Margaret Calloway was doing the opposite. She was making it exactly as big a deal as it was, loudly, with an enthusiasm that suggested she had attended many events in her life, but had perhaps never cared about an outcome quite this specifically. Edward was beside her, slightly more contained, applauding with the genuine warmth of someone who has had 6 months to understand that watching Ivy Chen Parsons do anything she has decided to do is consistently one of the more remarkable things available to witness. Sergeant Delgado was there too, off-duty in the third row. Victor Strand's trial had concluded in March, 13 years. She had called Edward with the verdict and then shown up at the house 2 days later with a plant for the newly restored garden, which she'd said was just a housewarming thing, and which Margaret had planted in the spot where the trellis used to be. Mrs. Obie, the chemistry teacher, was in the second row. She was quietly holding a letter from the Regional STEM Academy confirming Ivy's scholarship for the following academic year. She'd been asked by the Academy to be the one to present it, which she had found deeply satisfying and had agreed to immediately. Ivy crossed the finish line and pulled out her earbuds. She looked at the scoreboard. She let the number land. Then she looked at the stands and found the faces she was looking for, and she did something she didn't do often in public. She smiled, fully, without managing it. The adoption had been finalized in February. She was Ivy Chen Parsons Calloway now. She'd kept both names, all of them, because her mother's name was hers and her father's name was hers, and what the Calloways were adding was also hers. And she saw no reason to lose any of it. The hyphen was her mother's idea, carried forward. The Calloway was new and earned and chosen. The paperwork had been, as promised, extensive. The night it was finalized, they had dinner at a restaurant that Margaret chose because it served the kind of dumplings that Ivy had described from her mother's kitchen. She had found it specifically, had called ahead, had ascertained that the recipe was authentic to the regional style Ivy had described. It was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet, careful, specific one, the kind that costs thought rather than money. Ivy had eaten 3 portions and said very little and felt a warmth that she had no immediate word for except, after a while, the word that her mother had told her was her name: Hope. On a Sunday in April, 3 days after the invitational, Ivy went to the greenbelt, not to stay. She had somewhere to stay now. She went back because it seemed right to go back to close a loop that had been left open. The spot between the 2 oaks was still there. Nature had almost absorbed the evidence of the camp. The flattened area of undergrowth was recovering. The small stone drainage channel she'd built was filling with leaf litter. In another season, it would be entirely gone. She stood there for a while. She thought about her mother's annotations in the margins of borrowed books, about her father's voice explaining load-bearing structures and why triangles were the strongest shape, about a gray sedan and a fire and a window with someone behind it who needed to get out. She thought about the specific luck of having heard something rather than nothing that night, of having been awake, of having already known from 11 weeks of practice exactly how to move in the dark. She thought about what her mother had called her: hope in several languages, not safety, not certainty. Hope *. The creek ran along the eastern edge of the greenbelt, making the sound it always made, patient, indifferent to seasons, following its own logic all the way down to wherever it was going. Ivy listened to it for a while. Then she shouldered her bag, a new one, real this time, bought for the STEM Academy's summer intensive, and she walked back through the trees to the fence and over it and home. Please subscribe, like, share, turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The ENDNEXT.